It is currently very sunny, and so I'm sure people are keen to get out into the sun as well after. So thanks very much for being here, and a really warm welcome to this afternoon's webinar with the ETC Hub around this question: how can researchers support the practice of climate change education? Just say about the ETC Hub. Obviously, there's some colleagues online who have been really involved in lots of the work that we've been doing, and others new to it, but it's an interdisciplinary hub at Oxford and beyond that's associated with SCOPE, the Centre for Skills, Knowledge and Organisational Performance, that's led by James Robson here in the department, and brings together a real range of people from all divisions in the university and beyond to explore these questions around education and trainings, kind of commitment to contribution to the climate, kind of broadly conceived. We're really looking forward today to exploring some of these really significant researcher practitioner partnerships in the UK and the US, and are really delighted to be joined by two superstars, and really pleased that Professor Nicola Walshe and Professor Bora Simmons have both given up their time to be with us today. So thank you very much. I'm going to do some brief kind of introductions to both, and then we're going to have about 15 minutes presentations from both Nicola and Bora, and then following that, kind of an open time for taking that conversation forward and kind of questions and answers. And whilst the conversation, the presentations are going on, then please feel free to use the chat and to kind of add any questions there, as well as kind of later unmuting. But yeah, feel free to use that, and we'll come back to those questions. So Professor Nicola Walshe is the Pro-Director of Education at IOE, UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. And Nicola co-founded and is the Executive Director of the UCL Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education, which has this aim, obviously kind of really directly interacts with what we're thinking about today, of making a significant improvement to climate change and sustainability education within schools, and doing that largely by providing free professional development for teachers of all disciplines, phases and career stages, that's underpinned by some really high quality research. I'm sure we'll hear more about it, but Nicola and the Centre have conducted some major research on climate change education, and some international reviews as well, including for the British Council and others, to make this really significant contribution to the field. So Nicola, thank you very much for being with us and joining us today. And we're also joined by Professor Bora Simmons, who's based in Eugene, Oregon in the US, where she is physically, literally now, and serves as the founding director of the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education. Now, that project was initiated by the North American Association for Environmental Education in 1993, and to help educators develop and deliver effective environmental education programmes. Again, we'll hear more about it, but the project's drawn on the insights of thousands of educators across the US and the world, to craft guidelines for high quality environmental education. And Bora's held posts as a researcher at the University of Oregon and as a professor of environmental education at Northern Illinois University. So Nicola and Bora, I'm delighted to welcome you both. Thank you again for joining us. As I said, we'll kind of pause between for any clarifying questions, and then really get into kind of any substantive questions and discussion after both. So I'll hand straight over here to Bora.
Okay, well, hello everybody, and let me share my screen and see if that works. Did 5 minutes ago. That means it won't work now. There we go. So thank you so much for having me here today and to talk about something that I'm really excited about. As I was mentioned in my introduction, I do serve as the director of the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education, which is an initiative of NAAEE. And we are right on the cusp of publishing a new set of guidelines. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this particular set of guidelines, but the process in just a moment. The Guidelines for Excellence is something that was started. The project was started in the mid-1990s, and it was started because environmental education faced two particular challenges in the United States at the time. One was the development of the national standards movement. And as many of you probably know about our fair country, is that we have no national curriculum. Curriculum is created and efforts are made at the state level and sometimes even down to the local level. So when they started the idea of having national standards that would then be umbrella terms and adopted by the states, that sort of presented a threat to environmental education, but also an opportunity to EE. One of the threats was that, well, the curriculum becoming more and more standardized would mean that environmental education could end up being sort of more and more marginalized. And then the sort of opportunity was that, well, if we could articulate how environmental education basically helps serve this formal, standardized, assessed curriculum, we might be able to sort of wangle our way in a little bit more. The other threat that we faced at the time in the mid 90s was a movement from the conservative right. And basically, they were running around different parts of the country saying that environmental education indoctrinated children, and that in fact we were creating little green Nazis. And because we were creating little green Nazis, we should be banned from the public schools. So our sort of concern was, well, we didn't really think we were creating little green Nazis and that we weren't really inculcating and indoctrinating, at least not when good environmental education practice was in play. So we started this project, the Guidelines for Excellence, with the notion of trying to address specifically those two big issues. So the first set of guidelines that we developed was basically our equivalent to national standards for environmental literacy, to sort of what's that road towards environmental literacy within formal schooling. And then we also developed a set of guidelines that try to articulate what were good quality characteristics of good quality instructional materials. And through the years, you can see that we have sort of continued on this path and developed other sets of guidelines that sort of address different issues within the field. So early childhood environmental education, and then community engagement, trying to get that notion of that we often invite the community into the school. We invite the community into a nature center or a zoo or an aquarium. We might even take our learners out into the community, but to what extent were we actually working with the community? So that set of guidelines tried to address that issue. So we're we're almost at publication for a newest set of guidelines that's focusing on climate action and climate justice. But all of these sets of guidelines were developed using the same basic process. They're rooted in research and practice. So we start off the process by doing a literature review and looking at curriculum materials out there, looking at web spaces, looking at everything that we can gather that sort of where people are talking about the particular topic. They are all developed through a process of public participation. And as Stephen mentioned, we have anywhere from 800 to 2,500 individuals and organizations involved in the development of each set of guidelines, providing us feedback along the way. And one of the things that we like to sort of think about is that we're engaging educators to really discuss quality environmental education practices through that participation process where they get to look at a draft, they give us comments back, we produce a new draft, they give us comments back, we produce a new draft. But also after the sets of guidelines are developed, we like to try to think about it as that it's an opportunity for environmental educators to interrogate their own practice, but also to interrogate the guidelines and to say, well, what of this makes sense and what of it doesn't make sense? And we're hoping that we're helping to build EE as a profession. So that brings me to the newest set of guidelines, and I got this artwork of the cover just yesterday. So I was so excited to slip it into the slideshow. So it's a set of guidelines that's going to focus on education for climate action and justice. And in developing this set of guidelines, we used pretty much the same process that we have used for all of the other sets of guidelines. We did that background research to sort of come up with some very, very beginnings of a framework. But one of the things that we did a little different this time, because there's so much activity within climate education, at least in North America, certainly throughout the world, that we did 20 in-depth interviews with people throughout North America that had different sort of hats and perspectives on climate and climate education, to sort of try to begin to ask them questions about, well, what do they think are the essential principles or characteristics of good quality climate education? And we also use this group to sort of think about who we would want to bring together into the same room to talk about this and help us in the writing. So our writing team. And it's a phenomenal group of people who brought all sorts of different perspectives, researchers, people who run incredible international programs in climate education, early childhood educator, people from an aquarium background, environmental justice background. Frank Niepold is with NOAA, and he is basically, for the federal government, the chief and climate educator. He wouldn't want me to call him that. We also formed an advisory committee so that we could bounce ideas off of a bigger group of people and sort of tap into their perspectives. So you'll notice that Bill Finnegan is on our advisory committee, but we also had people from the federal government, the Environmental Protection Agency, and NOAA. We had some people from, again, early childhood and higher education, from our state departments of education. So a whole variety of different people, somebody from the Sunrise Movement. So in developing this set of guidelines, this newest set of guidelines, we sort of posed our big question, which was, sort of, what was this going to be for, and how would we provide recommendations and resources that support using education as a tool for addressing climate change? Pretty big, pretty broad, probably not overly controversial. But we had to sort of think about, well, all right, where is environmental education occurring, especially in North America? And what was needed? We certainly could have easily focused in on primary and secondary school. There's incredible needs for climate education in those settings, especially formal education. But we kept thinking about that, well, there were all these other settings. There's a lot of workforce development in climate education, especially in the United States. Faith leaders are involved. Youth leaders, community educators, all sorts of different people are involved in climate education. And we didn't want this set of guidelines just to stop at the edge of that graduation platform at the end of secondary school. So we basically broadened it out and said that it was for pretty much educators who are interested in using education as a tool for addressing climate change. We kind of couldn't have made it a whole lot bigger. But then as we continue to think about what was our tact going to be, how were we going to focus this? How were we going to sort of articulate where we were hoping that people would go or sort of think about in their practice. And one of the things that came into view pretty quickly was that people are very, very aware, and educators are very aware of the climate crisis. A lot of the education around the climate crisis in the United States, at least, is doom and gloom. It's about the crisis. And so what we wanted to do was to at least try to elevate and focus on the notion that there are solutions and that we can work towards those solutions. And in doing that, we decided that what we really wanted to do was to work on this notion of fostering climate action. So again, in the United States at least, a lot of the climate education is about climate change. It's the climate, in fact, it's even climate science for the most part. And we wanted to move beyond that about climate change to being for climate action, and especially individual action and um, collective action. Because again, at least in the United States, a lot of environmental education focuses on individual actions and not so much collective actions. Then sort of of course, is that we also wanted this to center on climate justice and taking that seriously to say that it's required that you have an understanding and centering on climate justice and a willingness to work towards the solutions that address the impact of climate change. So this was sort of, again, one of our major pillars to the development of the guidelines. So as we developed the guidelines, as we met as a team, we originally looked back at that research and those interviews and all of the information we had gathered and the wisdom of the people in the room. We came up with 5 key characteristics of quality climate change education. And basically just think of them as big buckets of ideas so that we can kind of sort through things and talk about something in a reasonable way. So the first key characteristic was basically around the notion that, well, we're educators. And as educators, when we put together an education program or process, when we're facilitating, whether it's with the community or in that 3rd grade classroom, that we need to make sure that it's collaborative and welcoming and responsive, and that we're creating those sorts of learning environments. So that it's inclusive learning, that it's inquiry-based, that we're really exploring worldviews, and very important, again, at least for the United States and Canada too, is that examining climate change information and misinformation, and really making sure that we're welcoming that kind of investigation. The second key characteristic is probably not too surprising. You might have different ideas about what the component parts are, but it's that notion that there should be some sort of foundational knowledge and skills as you go out into climate education and as a learner. So, these were, building awareness and climate processes and understanding the systems, understanding human systems thinking, just how do you develop action strategies and skills, building personal and civic responsibility. So this is all the basic stuff that you would hope shows up in most climate education activities. The third key characteristic is really an attention on climate emotions. So this too is a recognition that anytime we delve into climate change and start to talk about the systems and the impacts and all of those sorts of things, that we have to recognize and acknowledge the climate emotions. But it's more than recognition that we have to cultivate the constructive hope and develop self-efficacy, help the learners develop self-efficacy and agency. So the first three key characteristics are things that you would probably see in just about, well, you would hope maybe that you'd see in just about any sort of program. Where the fourth and fifth key characteristics shift a bit to our sort of centering on climate action was that we basically say that for the most part, it whatever your action is and the learning about climate education needs to be locally focused and community driven. So it's saying that, well, if you're going to do some sort of climate action, that you need to go out, you need to know the community, identify the key individuals and organizations, communities of interest, build partnerships and collaborative relationships. And very importantly, you need to talk to them and you need to find out what the community concerns are about climate action so that you, the learners, the facilitator in this process, aren't just sort of going off and doing what they care about, that you're doing what the community cares about. And that brings me to the last of the key characteristics where this sort of all comes together in a process of saying that you are enhancing the civic engagement for climate action. So if you further investigate those community-centered concerns, learn more about them, you select a particular action goal and plan for achieving it, you actually take the action on your selected climate issue and concern, and then you hopefully celebrate and share your progress. And so having that sort of evaluative self-reflection celebration piece at the end. Um, Throughout the guidelines, so there are these big key characteristics, and those bullet points are what we call guidelines. And then underneath each of those bullet points are further sort of little bullet points, typically somewhere about 5 to 8 or so. It's little sort of explanations or examples of what it looks like in practice. So if somebody were doing this, what might they be doing? So that's kind of the core to the guidelines, but we also have a series of boxes in the guidelines that just try to help people sort of imagine a bit more, help them understand a bit more, at least about what we're talking about. So we have a series of boxes that are called Did You Know? And they're basically things like this: the principles of environmental justice and climate change justice, but they also, we have definitions, just basic definitions of different terms that people might not have run into before. We also have boxes called resources you can use, which basically are more explanatory, but really get into references, URLs and other references, so that if somebody wants to learn more about the particular topic, they can. And then finally, we have guidelines in practice, which are these short sort of cases that describe some activity that's out there, some group of people who are working on climate action and climate justice, and what does it look like? So all of this is up online. Well, the new set of guidelines will be online probably within about another month at our website, which is just simply nwaae.org, and then look under programs for guidelines for excellence. And then one last little bit of advert for NAAE is that we do have a climate change education sort of piece to our website that has some of the research that NAAE has been involved with. We have a climate change EE Pro group of just people who come together and ask each other questions and share information. All sorts of different, some climate justice resources and such. So with that, that's my quick and dirty explanation of what I do.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Bora. Really appreciated that.
Certainly.
We've got now a couple of minutes. If people have any clarifying questions, anything brief and urgent that they kind of wanted to ask before we move over to Nicola. So now's an opportunity to kind of do that either in the chat or by kind of raising hands. Really just kind of any quick clarifying questions before you forget anything that's kind of in your mind. And otherwise, whilst kind of allow that moment, then if we switch screens and Nicola, if you want to come on and get screen shared and so on, that'd be brilliant. Mark, just feel free to unmute and go for it.
Hi there, thanks Bora, that was fascinating, and I can't imagine how difficult it is to be a climate change educator in some of the states in America. I was interested to ask you, how, if you're able to link, because I know there's some great work around decolonial practice in the States. I was just interested to see whether that was language that had been engaged with around the climate justice kind of issues, or had there been a kind of a strategic decision to that was too far in the cultural war zone to go for it?
That's a great question. We had lots of discussions around that as a team. Even that very first key characteristic that's just about good quality, welcoming instruction. We talk about culturally relevant instruction and teaching. And we got comments back from people in states like Georgia and Florida that says, you can't talk about that. And we kind of went, yeah, we can, and we are going to. So we kind of put a line in the sand, as it were, and we did use some of that. But in one of our very first drafts, we talked about colonialism, and we talked about minoritizing people and minorities and disenfranchisement, and used basically that language. And interestingly, we got back a lot of feedback. Some of it was negative. It was basically well, although I agree with you, we can't use that. And if you use that language, we're just not going to even be able to, because a lot of these people are working for state agencies. So they would never be able to share this document if we were using that kind of language. It would be banned. Unfortunate state. But we had a number of people who work specifically, in an organization called We Act for Environmental Justice, who basically said, it's not necessary. We can talk about these issues in ways that get across the ideas without using the language that is going to trigger that sort of response. And that, in fact, there was sort of an agreement within the group, and we had to go around a number of times to get there, but of using more of a sort of appreciative inquiry perspective, of sort of saying, what are the positive things, recognize that there is an issue, then what is it that we can do about it? And sort of not focusing on the oh, doom, oh, horrible, oh, we've been very bad people, because we have, but what is it that we can do about it now? And how do you learn more about what's going on in your community so that you can help fix your community? So that's kind of how we negotiated it. It is difficult. It's very, very difficult. It was also recognizing that the document is meant for that broad range of people who were not necessarily academics, who I will almost guarantee you that if I said something to my neighbors who are teachers about colonial perspectives and climate justice, they would just sort of glaze over and say, so you're talking about 1776? They wouldn't, that wouldn't make sense. But if you talked about, well, some people in our community, there are these issues, and these issues are because of the rules and regulations that are created, or what the banks do, or historically what the banks did. They would go, oh yeah, of course, I knew about that. So part of it was just communication, so that people knew what we were talking about.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Thanks for that question, Mark, and thanks very much for loads of to kind of get into. I'm going to hand straight over now to Nicola.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me this afternoon. It's great and so interesting to hear Bora speak, and I think there'll be synergies between some of the things I'm saying, hopefully. So thank you. As Steve's very kindly introduced, I'm the Executive Director of the UCL Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education, and I'm going to talk a little bit about well, the centre's broader work, but in particular our professional development programme for teachers, which is called Teaching for Sustainable Futures. And I'm going to frame that in thinking about how we work to and our research intersects with that as a professional development programme for teachers. So just to give you a really brief recap, I know many of you on the call already know about the centre, so I'm not going to spend too long on this, but just to reassert, which Steve has already really kindly introduced, the centre, which has got this weird acronym, CCCSE, aims to support teachers to develop the capabilities they need to prepare young people for a climate-altered future. So we obviously, the sort of end point is to educate children and young people as best we can, and we feel that one of the best ways to do that is through supporting teachers to be able to do that. And the sort of triangle on the bottom left is sort of showing or trying to illustrate how we do that. So we have research as the pillar underneath that, and that would be our own research, and we have sort of some main core projects that we do in the centre, which I'll talk briefly about now, but also other disciplinary research that we draw on across UCL and beyond, so not just education research. We then have the professional development, which is fed into by that research, which I'll talk to you about towards the end of this presentation. And then we do have policy engagement work, which I'm going to talk less about today, but of course they're all really closely interwoven and interlinked. So some of that policy work is at COP. So I've been undertaken work at the last 2 COPs to around working with governments, policymakers, NGOs, etc., to support sort of global work around climate and sustainability education. And then some also consultancy work, and as I say, working with the NGOs to support their work, etc. So happy to answer questions on that, but I won't probably talk much about it in the actual presentation itself. So what I'm going to do is talk about 2 pieces of research that we've undertaken as main pieces. And just to sort of say, the centre has only been in existence for just over 2 years now. So we were launched in April 2022 at the same time as the Department for Education's strategy of climate change and sustainability. So a very similar time. So we sort of what we're doing, what we're achieving is a lot of it is very much ongoing. But the 2 pieces of research, the first one is a survey we did of teachers in England. And the reason I'm talking about this and then the survey of young people, which is the next piece of work, is just to really to start to illustrate the work that we're doing and how we're trying to feed that into what we're developing in terms of the professional development work for teachers. So the aim of the teacher survey was to generate new insight into the state of climate change and sustainability education in England. So there had been other smaller surveys and of course international surveys as well. But given the sort of really significant development within the policy context in England, we thought that it would be really good to get a benchmark of what teachers were telling us in terms of their experiences, their professional development, and also what they wanted. So what are the opportunities therefore to exist to enhance that climate change and sustainability education in England. So we were thinking about what the key questions were around what existed in a very future and forward-looking way. So how could we then feed that into what we were doing to support teachers moving forward? So we had 874 responses for that. Interestingly, but not unsurprisingly, we had the large majority of those responses were from geography and science teachers. Of course, we call them a sort of climate engaged or climate education engaged cohort, because of course those that were more already engaged were much more likely to respond to the survey. So that's a big caveat to some of the results. So while we're looking at the results on the next page, we need to look at that through a lens of knowing that actually it's teachers who are genuinely engaged who are replying. Who were responding. And we also had responses from secondary all the way down to primary and early years. And I'm going to just give you a few really brief headlines. I'm not going, there's a lot more data. There's a report which I'll put the QR code to at the end, and we've got some papers sort of just submitted at the moment. But some of the key findings were around practice and then around professional development. So in terms of practice, unsurprisingly, perhaps climate change and or sustainability were most commonly incorporated into teaching in geography and science at secondary levels and at secondary levels. And there was a strong positive correlation between those whose initial teacher education or pre-service teaching had included teacher education had included a focus on climate change and sustainability, and those who incorporated related content into their teaching. So we got a real sense that, yes, perhaps unsurprisingly, the geographers and the scientists were those who were responding and those who were saying that they incorporated this into their practice, but also where people were saying that they incorporated it, if they had done it within their initial teacher education, that was a really key in sort of predicting whether they would be teaching about it. However, having said that, and I've sort of jumped to this sort of 12.6% figure on that right-hand side there, only 12.6% had reported a focus on climate change and sustainability in their initial teacher education. So we're talking here, as I say, geography and scientists predominantly, although a range of other subjects, but only still 12.6% of them had had any climate change and sustainability education during their ITE, which is really problematic. In terms of broader professional development, and again, we were asking this because we wanted to think about what the implications might be for professional development and supporting teachers more broadly. So less than half of the respondents, so 44.9%, reported participating in any formal professional development related to climate change and sustainability. And that still could be, it didn't need to be sort of face-to-face, it could still be online, but it was sort of formally recognised professional development. And within that, the most common type of professional development or thing that they talked about was self-taught. So we found that actually teachers were having to teach themselves about climate change and sustainability education. And in some of the more free text comments, they were saying that was causing a lot of challenge. It was time consuming. They were having to search around. They weren't sure about the quality of the resources. If they were looking at climate change or the science, which some of them were, they weren't sure about whether it was accurate, the information that they were trying to find. So all in all, really unsatisfactory in terms of, yes, it gave them the flexibility to teach them in the time that they liked, but it was very difficult in terms of reliability and quality of what they were producing. The last one on this survey I just wanted to present to you was we asked them about what areas of support they would like to enhance the climate change and sustainability education. Interestingly, particularly those of you that know the kind of English national curriculum content, the sort of greatest thing, so about 58% on there, was that they wanted it to be within the national curriculum. Now, those of you that are aware of the policy context within England will know that it isn't in the national curriculum explicitly, a little bit in geography and science, but really often implicit rather than explicit, and not foreground at all in most subjects. And actually the climate education, climate change and sustainability education strategy doesn't talk about the curriculum. So yes, teachers can teach about it, even though it's not in the national curriculum, but teachers are telling us they would rather it be in there. And of course, that would mean really it would provide potentially a baseline so that every young child or young person experience climate change and sustainability education, which we think is really important. The other things that they felt that would be interested is support and opportunities to develop teaching materials. They didn't feel that they could do that or knew how to do it because they didn't have that support. And also support from external organisations. They recognised that they needed that help again. So there's sort of three of the interesting findings. And of course, there were more than that, but just to give you a flavour about some of the things. So one of the things that we've done in response to that is our professional development is think about how we might respond to give flexibility around the self-taught and providing professional development, providing discipline-specific professional development so that teachers of all subjects can engage with this, even though it's not in the national curriculum, to get that support. And I'll come on to that shortly. I'm aware of time, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was our survey of students. Now, this is extremely preliminary results, but that's really exciting and hot off the press, so I wanted to mention it. So we undertook a survey just in the spring of this year, so it's only been closed about a month, and we're busy analysing the data. But the reason that we wanted to do that is we looked at teacher perspectives, and then we wanted to see if they were mirrored in the experience of our young people. And so we did a survey of year 7, 8 and 9, so ages 11 to 14 students. And you can see that it's a long survey. We deliberately wanted a lot of information to get really rich data. And it was predominantly administered by teachers, and we're very, very grateful to those teachers within schools. So while the teachers would likely to be teachers who were keen on sustainability and climate change, if they were doing it with a whole class, meant we got a whole range of student experiences and voices in terms of their demographics, but also their engagement with climate change more broadly. And we wanted to ask questions like, what do they understand about the concept of climate change and sustainability? How do they feel about it? What are their experiences in school? What do they want in school? And then we also asked them about their relationships with nature and their behaviours, and as I say, demographic data, and you can see there a little bit at the bottom. And as I say, very early data, but some of the things that sort of are emerging from that are that students are concerned. Unsurprisingly, a lot of what we've seen echoes the other research out there. So, for example, 67% of students said they feel sad when they think about it. There are 76% of students that said they think it's important to learn about. So again, that echoes existing surveys and information about children and young people. However, they don't feel empowered to act. So only 29%, for example, say they feel able to influence how their school's responding to climate change. So really disempowered, and it very much links in with Bora, and you'll see in a minute around our Teaching for Sustainable Futures, is that giving agency and empowering children and young people is so important, and clearly that they're telling us they don't feel that at the moment. 66% of students say they know what they can do to look after the environment, which is still not that high, given the amount of work we're trying to do and what's in the media. But this does mask a significant sort of difference around socioeconomic status. So those, and we measured this using books. I've not got time to go. So what a sort of a known measure around number of books in the house. So 75% of children or students with a high number of books in their house say that they know what to do, but only 49% of children and young people with low numbers of books in the house. And there's a lot of around disadvantage difference across all of the different measures, actually, which is really, really interesting, going back to that equity. And then the last point I just wanted to say is students do not think learning about climate change and sustainability will give them more job opportunities. So only 31% thought that, which is really interesting. And actually, they didn't want to work in a job related to climate change and sustainability. So only 17% that they said they wanted to do that. So again, they're not seeing the relevance to their futures. They're thinking, oh, yeah, it's important to learn about this, to have education. But they don't see the relevance, which of course is really important, because I would argue that most jobs in the future are going to be green jobs. So that's kind of a really whistle-stop tour through some of our research. And I just want to very quickly talk about some of the Teaching for Sustainable Futures professional development programme. And as I say at the end, because I know I've only got a couple of minutes left, I will show some QR codes which you can access and find out more information. So our professional development is really important that it's online, but it's free for everybody. And we have a number of principles there, which you can see. So it's empowering for teachers. It is research engaged, but it's also knowledge engaged. So it's disciplinary knowledge. It's futures focused. So thinking, and very much what Bora said in terms of hope and future. And it's also pedagogically adventurous. So we're thinking differently how we might engage with children and young people. We have a series of outcomes for young people, which again, we sort of underpins all of the work that we do, we think, which is really important. And we could unpick all of these in half an hour, but I haven't got that. So I'm just going to show them to you. But again, link and chime very much with what Bora said. In terms, every child or young person has the agencies and capabilities to act. They're equipped to contribute to a socially just, equitable and compassionate world. They experience a lifelong connection with nature, which enhances physical and mental well-being. And then they understand the planet as an interconnected system and their place in human and more than human communities. So these have been things that we've emerged out of much debating and discussing with all sorts of partners, subject associations, teachers, young people, etc. but they now underpin everything that we do. And the way that we do this, we've got, I'll show you what subjects we've got at the moment. As I say, they're discipline focused. There's a sort of overarching module, which is a video with some questions, which is that first looking to the future one. And then each subject and phase then has a sort of module which thinks about the potential. So that looks at the sort of discipline and shows how it connects to climate change and sustainability. And of course, there's videos, that interactive activities, etc. through these. They're short modules. They're sort of an hour and a half, these potential modules. And then they each have an exemplification module or multiple exemplification modules. So the bottom layer there is, for an example, from Stone Age to Iron Age for the potential of primary history, which goes through how you might engage with children and young people through that topic in history. And we are doing the best we can to get through the subject as much as possible. So we already have history and geography primary and secondary, maths primary, secondary, and English from primary, secondary, I think is out in a couple, it's sort of next week. I think we've got the primary, the secondary is out next week. Autumn we'll have science secondary, and next year, well, hot off the press, we've got those subjects and hopefully potentially a few more, potentially MFL as well. So we're trying to get, because we think it's really important to look at those disciplinary lenses. And I think I'm about out of time, so I'm going to just leave that up for 20 seconds, but you can get it on our website. If you Google us, you'll find us. And on there is the survey, the publications, and of course, the link to the professional development programme and some more of our work around policy engagement. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Nicola. I mean, feel free to leave that slide there for a moment if you'd like, so that people can definitely kind of get a look at it and make sure that they've got those QR codes and stuff down. Yeah, let's leave that there for a moment. That was brilliant.
Steve.
Thanks so much. And no, that was such a good whistle stop. And I'm sorry that we've only got kind of 12 minutes or something to kind of open up some of these questions. And I've just put a note in the chat there to say to kind of make the most of this brief bit of time. I think it'd be really helpful. Any questions that people have, to maybe use that as well, and then we can have a look and see if there are kind of themes and so on that we can kind of group together to then put to Nicola and Bora. Whilst people are doing that, I'm just going to use my kind of chair's privilege to just, Nicola, on the one thing that really struck me was, so this particular group of, you described them as like climate engaged participants, and the percentage who wanted more reference in national curriculum, I think it was about 57% wanted more. That struck me as being really kind of low, that kind of nearly half, 43%, whatever, are saying no, that's enough. There's kind of enough mention. Whereas, like, normally the kind of narrative is that look, there's basically none. It came about at a really politicized time. No mention of national curriculum. Did you get a sense of, or do you have a sense of kind of like why that's like that? What are the,
So I think, well, I mean, we need to do more qualitative data to kind of follow up on some of these things. But my sort of suggestion would be that actually, if you're thinking about them as being climate engaged, they know how they can subvert the curriculum to include it, so they can include it whether or not it's in there. It's the ones that are more nervous, that don't understand how it relates to their discipline or how they do it, that would want it in there, because they would use that then as guidance and support. I know the national curriculum doesn't provide guidance and support, but it would give them that impetus or force people to do it. So that would be why I would see that. So yes, some people are saying they want it, but I think those that are already engaged with it are just like, well, we can do it anyway. It doesn't matter whether it's in the national curriculum, which of course you can, but it's only those who are engaged that tend to do it, because it's left a bit more to chance if it's not explicitly in there. Yeah,
no, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, thanks, Meryl, for that point. These teachers, oh yes, also in terms of the students that have taken part, and potentially that kind of, that representation of that group. I mean, if there's no other questions right now, then I'll kind of carry on with a kind of question to Bora, but Nicola, feel free to obviously chip in as well. But it was one about kind of change over time. So one of the big kind of things that you kind of highlighted later on was this notion of climate justice. My sense from kind of like the literature is that that's something, an aspect of environmental education that has kind of increased massively, a kind of focus on justice and some of these questions around kind of coloniality and so on. Like, from your experience over that time, from kind of the mid-90s to now, does that seem kind of true, fair to you? Is that a shift in terms of the way that those kind of discourses and practice have changed over that time?
I would say absolutely. I mean, at least again in the United States, we look back to the notion of environmental justice, that as being a named thing, really doesn't even sort of really start showing up until the early 90s. The practices, the impacts, the things that were going on in society, obviously were always there. They just weren't named as being environmental justice. And it wasn't really until the 90s. And in all honesty, I could say that in general, our practice in the United States was to ignore it, to say, oh yeah, we recognize that that's happening, but we're focusing on this part of our practices. Over the years, it has definitely become more and more explicit. And I'll give you an example that those K-12 guidelines, which are basically our equivalent to the national standards, when we first developed them, and they were first published in 1999, there was no mention of environmental justice. I don't even know that the word justice showed up anywhere. I mean, maybe something about the justice system. I'm not positive about that, but certainly not in that notion of social justice or environmental justice or climate justice. As we revise them, because we try to revise everything about every 5 to 7 years, we started to be more expressive in terms of describing the situations. So we might talk about redlining. Redlining is this banking practice in the United States that basically said, oh, that community, that neighborhood, we're going to draw a red line around it because that's where people of color live. We're not going to give loans there. And so people can't buy their houses. And so that notion of pulling communities and deliberately sort of keeping them down. So we may have started to sort of describe it a bit more. And with our newest revision, which was in 2019, we explicitly talk about environmental justice. And with this set of guidelines, it's in the title. So I would say that, it is a recognition. It's a push from society, but it's also trying to push our field to be more admitting of these and become more comfortable using the terms.
Thanks very much. Just
Sure.
kind of to pick up on the questions in the chat, Nicola, I don't know if you want to kind of start on Kathy's, if you can, if you've seen Kathy's, and then Bora will come to a kind of, Bora, you'll have a 2-minute window to answer Amelia's twofold question. But yeah, Nicola, do you want to pick up Kathy's?
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. I think that's a really important point, which I didn't say. And one of the reasons we would argue that the climate change and sustainability education should be sort of considered by all subjects is because that supports as not creating more anxiety. There is research, although there are various sort of compounding factors, but that shows that if we're just learning it through science or even just bits of geography, but in a very scientific way, then we can either turn students off or make them more anxious. So that's really, really important. And if we would, when we're looking next year, for example, at through music and arts, we would be hoping that we're doing it in a way that really gives them space to think and internalize some of the emotions associated with climate change that they're feeling and that they're telling us that they're feeling. The other thing is that Bora also mentioned is hope. So hope is a theme that runs through our work. So we try to frame it through case studies, whatever the subject, and ways of looking at the future, which is hopeful, that makes them, through that gives them agency, but also hope. And then my own personal research, which is through Eco Capabilities in particular project and a few other projects, is looking at arts in nature and children's well-being, particularly in primary school. So and part of that is very much the aim of, and you saw one of the underpinning aims that we want for children and young people is nature connection and experiences of nature. But I work with artists and then working with teachers and artists to support teachers to develop that practice that connects them with nature through the arts. I can put some links in the chat if you've not come across the project. But again, that's trying to give them that different relationship with nature, which, yes, might also make them feel more anxious if they suddenly think it's all going to to end, but gives them space and a way of dealing with their emotions that connects them to nature, that allows them to, again, reflect on some of the hope as well as the challenge that's not just in a science, the end of the world is nigh kind of way. So yeah, really, really important. I think the other thing just to note, and this is coming out in our survey data, is that not every young person is anxious, and that is really based on demographics, that is really different. It's certainly in our survey data. So again, unsurprisingly perhaps, but the girls are much more anxious than the boys, but also the people with more books at home, so the kind of less disadvantaged, are more anxious than the so disadvantaged. And we talked about environmental justice in that previous question. Is really important, not only in how we're teaching, but also how we're reflecting on the experience that children, young people are having of climate education. Some of them, it's just not important, they're not connected to it in a way, and we need to think about pedagogies and approaches that can connect them and engage them, but also in a hopeful way as well.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Nicola. Bora, really sorry, just 2 minutes, kind of brief thoughts. And then the final question that we'll pick up for like a ridiculous 30 seconds is the question of peace education from Mark. So, Bora.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak to the peace education other than to say that I know certainly in North America, it is not an overwhelmingly large community. It's not something that is talked about particularly. Certainly there are the huge overlaps with a lot of what we do. I just was speaking with somebody with human rights, and talking about human rights and the huge overlaps with environmental education. But yeah, I mean, I think that the last little thoughts from my perspective is that we have a huge amount of work to do. And when we do have communities, like in many parts of the United States, where we are polarized so much, that you have to try to figure out, it's basic communication. You have to figure out what it is that the overlap is. We do a lot of work with deliberation and that notion of, well, what is the common ground, and move from that common ground. And if you take that kind of perspective, it's slow work, but education is slow work. That's why people don't like education, is that they want to get out there and make change. And change doesn't occur quickly with education. But what our work is basically trying to say is that, that work is important. It's important to have those venues where people in the community can come together, where teachers can come together, where different people, and they can speak about these issues in their language and with their concerns, and then move on from there and find the common ground, especially in polarized communities.
Thanks so much, Bora. I really appreciate keeping to that 2 minutes. Nicola, is there anything very brief that you'd like to add to that?
Not with that one. I can have a quick go at Mark's, if you would like. Great to ask a really hard question with 1 minute to go, Mark. But I think a couple of things. One, in my experience, teachers are scared of approaching anything vaguely political anyway, because of the draft version of the DfE strategy that came out that talked about sort of any sort of activism, politicization of the issue as being hugely problematic. So I think we're in a position where we're having to support teachers to engage in even looking at geospatial sort of inequities in causes, impacts. So we're just not there yet. So I think it's a combination of teachers feel nervous about it, and they also don't feel empowered to do it because they don't have the professional development. But you're right, we need to think more about the kind of broader elements of which covers it under sort of environmental justice and social justice within sustainability as well. It's a good question.
Amazing. I feel really awful cutting us off there and stopping. Yeah, we could obviously go on for hours. Just say a massive thank you again, Nicola and Bora. That's been just brilliant and so much for us to kind of think about and to take forward. So really appreciate again your time, and thanks very much, colleagues, for all joining us on this Friday afternoon or morning, whatever it is for you. Do look out for other ETC Hub stuff that's kind of going on. There's kind of various events kind of planned, and a special issue of the the Review of Education that's kind of in progress at the minute as well. So thanks again, and I hope you have a brilliant weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone.